It was the autumn of 1995, and every day after school, 13-year-old Alex took the same path home, a shortcut that led through the town's old cemetery. It wasn't the most comforting route, but it saved a good 15 minutes, which meant he could beat the rush of older kids who liked to loiter around the main street. The cemetery had always been strangely quiet, with rows of crumbling tombstones and twisted trees. Alex wasn't one to be afraid. He'd walked this path so often that the place felt almost familiar. But on one particular evening, things changed. That day, Alex stayed late for a school project and didn't start heading home until 8 p.m. The sky had darkened, and a thick, unnatural fog had settled over the cemetery, rolling in from the edges and creeping toward the center. As he approached, he could see vague shapes moving in the mist, as if people were drifting through it. "Is there anyone here?" Alex called out, his voice trembling despite himself. Silence. His own echo seemed to mock him as it bounced back. He took a deep breath and stepped into the fog, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The shapes around him seemed to waver, almost as if they were watching him. But when he squinted, there was nothing, just shadows twisting in the mist. It was as he walked further that his foot hit something hollow, and he stumbled, falling forward. He caught himself just in time, only to look down and realize that he was standing at the edge of a freshly dug hole. The fog seemed to thicken around it, almost like it was trying to pull him in. As he peered down into the pit, he realized what he was looking at. A grave, open and waiting. And directly across from him, on the other side of the grave, was a tombstone. Polished and reflective, almost like a mirror. The name carved into it was unreadable, smudged out as though by an unseen hand. But as he leaned closer, the polished surface caught his reflection. And standing behind him was someone, or something. Alex spun around, heart pounding, to find himself face to face with a man he recognized but knew shouldn't be there. It was the carpenter who had once worked in their neighborhood, a man who had died years ago. His face was half missing, and one arm hung at a strange angle, as if it were still incomplete, still waiting for the rest of him to be put together. Paralyzed by terror, Alex stood frozen as the figure slowly began to reach toward him, its one good hand outstretched. Finally, the spell broke, and he turned and ran. He ran through the fog, which seemed to stretch on forever, the cemetery growing longer and longer, as if it would never end. When he finally saw headlights in the distance, he felt a surge of relief and dashed toward them. A car stopped and the driver, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, let him in. Alex didn't explain. He simply asked to be taken home, his voice trembling as he glanced nervously around him. But as they neared his house, Alex looked into the rearview mirror, and there, sitting in the back seat, was the carpenter. Panicked, Alex bolted from the car as soon as they stopped. He ran inside, closed all the mirrors in the house, and hid under his blankets until the morning light seeped through the curtains. That night, he barely slept, but he told himself it was just a nightmare, a trick of his imagination. In the morning, he told his parents, expecting them to laugh it off. But they grew pale, and after exchanging a few tense glances, they made a decision. They would leave the town, leave that school, and never come back. Years passed, and Alex thought he'd left that terrifying night behind him. But as he grew older, strange memories would sometimes return, resurfacing in his dreams. He would see the fog, the shifting shadows, and always the mirror tombstone. That cursed reflection haunted him, lurking in his mind whenever he was alone. When he was 25, Alex's curiosity got the better of him. He had moved back to the town for work, despite the lingering dread he felt about the cemetery. One night, after a few drinks with old friends, he shared the story of that night in the fog, expecting them to laugh. Instead, his friend Jack looked at him with a serious expression. "You saw the mirror tombstone? People have talked about that thing for years. They say if you look into it, you can see the dead. Not just anyone, though, the dead who have unfinished business with the living." Curious and a little drunk, Alex asked Jack if he knew anything more. "They say that if you see someone behind you in the reflection, it means they're bound to you. They have something to tell you, or something they need from you. And if you ignore it, they'll follow you forever. Chilled by his friend's words, Alex brushed it off as superstition. But deep down, he knew it was real. The carpenter, that strange, lingering spirit, was still out there, waiting. That night, unable to sleep, Alex did the unthinkable. He went back to the cemetery, determined to find the mirror tombstone and put an end to whatever curse had followed him. But when he arrived, the cemetery seemed different, larger, as though it had grown in his absence. And soon enough, the fog began to gather around him once more. As he walked deeper into the cemetery, Alex felt the fog wrap around him like a shroud, muffling all sound. He searched for the mirror tombstone, the place where he'd last seen the carpenter, but it was nowhere to be found. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a faint, raspy whisper. "Alex!" He froze. The voice seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the fog. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The fog parted slightly, and there, standing a few feet away, was the carpenter, looking exactly as he had that night all those years ago. Half a face, one hand reaching out, as if he were begging for something. "What do you want?" Alex demanded, his voice barely a whisper. The carpenter's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, he pointed toward the ground. Alex looked down and saw an old, weathered toolbox half buried in the dirt. Tentatively, he bent down and picked it up. The rusted latch creaked as he opened it, revealing a set of carpenter's tools, each covered in a fine layer of dust, and something else. A letter, tucked beneath the tools, addressed to A. Johnson. Alex's heart raced as he realized the carpenter had been trying to deliver a message all along. A message that had gone undelivered for years. With shaking hands, Alex unfolded the letter. The handwriting was scrawled and uneven, as though it had been written in haste. The words were cryptic and disturbing. "To whoever finds this, beware. There are things in this world worse than death, things that linger in shadows. I tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen. Now they're trapped, waiting in the fog. You must leave before it's too late, before the fog takes you to this place. It isn't just a cemetery. It's a threshold." A shiver ran down Alex's spine. He felt as though the fog around him was alive, listening, watching. He glanced around, half expecting to see more figures emerging from the mist. As he pocketed the letter, he realized the carpenter was gone. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the path back to the entrance of the cemetery. But Alex felt a strange pull, an urge to walk deeper, to uncover the truth about this place. And so, despite every instinct telling him to run, he walked further into the heart of the cemetery. The deeper he went, the darker the fog grew, until it felt almost tangible, like a living thing pressing in on him. Shapes began to materialize. Faces, hands reaching out, frozen in anguish. He realized with horror that these were spirits, trapped in the fog, bound to this place just as the carpenter had warned. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him, and he found himself standing before the mirror tombstone once again. This time, the reflection wasn't his own. In the mirror, he saw himself lying in a grave, the carpenter standing over him with a solemn expression. It was then that he understood. The cemetery wasn't just a resting place. It was a prison for souls with unfinished business. And the carpenter, in trying to warn him, had saved him from a fate worse than death. Alex ran, his heart pounding, the fog chasing him all the way to the entrance. As he crossed the threshold, the fog vanished, leaving him breathless but free. The next day, Alex left town, vowing never to return. He had escaped the cemetery, but he knew that not everyone would be so lucky. The mirror tombstone remained, waiting for the next unwitting soul to cross its path. And the fog, thick and silent, continued to roll in, waiting. Several years had passed since Alex left his hometown, but the memory of that terrifying night at the cemetery lingered. He tried to rebuild his life, moving to a different city, getting a new job, and even forming new friendships. But no matter how hard he tried to forget, the past had a way of creeping back into his life. It started with dreams, strange, unsettling dreams that felt too real. In them, Alex would find himself once again walking through the dense fog, surrounded by shadowy figures drifting around him. The mirror tombstone would always appear at some point, reflecting his face alongside the face of someone else, usually the carpenter. But recently, there was someone new. A woman with long, tangled hair and empty eyes, standing just behind him in the reflection. Each time he tried to turn and look at her, he would wake up in a cold sweat. Night after night, the dreams grew more vivid, and Alex felt as though he was being pulled back to that place, back to the cemetery and the secrets it held. One night, after another one of these relentless dreams, he awoke with a sudden realization. The woman in his dreams. He recognized her now. She had been one of the missing persons from his hometown, a woman named Evelyn who had vanished around the same time as the carpenter. She'd been rumored to have some connection to the cemetery, but her body had never been found. The more he thought about it, the more Alex felt compelled to return. Something was calling him back, and he knew that until he confronted it, the nightmares would never stop. A week later, Alex found himself standing at the gates of the old cemetery, staring into the misty expanse that stretched out before him. The place was exactly as he remembered, silent, eerie, and covered in a thick blanket of fog that seemed almost alive. He felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stepped inside, retracing the path he had taken as a teenager. Every stone, every tree felt familiar, as though they had been waiting for him all these years. He walked deeper, feeling the fog wrap around him like a cold embrace, muffling every sound until he was completely isolated from the world outside. As he moved through the fog, he began to see faint shadows flickering at the edges of his vision. They were people, but their forms were indistinct, blurry, as if they were only half real. Alex called out, but his voice barely echoed, swallowed by the fog. Finally, he reached the heart of the cemetery, where he knew the mirror tombstone would be waiting. But this time it looked different. The tombstone was cracked, as if something had tried to break through from the inside. And in its polished surface, Alex didn't see his own reflection. Instead, he saw the face of Evelyn, the missing woman from his hometown. She seemed to be staring directly at him, her lips moving soundlessly. Slowly, Alex leaned in, trying to make out her words, until her voice began to echo faintly in his mind. "Help me." As he stared into the tombstone, Alex felt a strange force pulling him forward. The fog around him thickened, and for a moment, he thought he saw Evelyn's hand reach out from the reflection, beckoning him to come closer. He backed away, his heart racing, but then he heard it, a chorus of faint whispers rising from the mist, surrounding him on all sides. They were pleading, desperate voices, each one a fragment of a soul trapped in the cemetery. Among the voices, he heard the familiar rasp of the carpenter. "You need to finish what we started," the carpenter's voice whispered, echoing through the fog. "They need to be set free." "Who? Set who free?" Alex called out, his voice trembling. But instead of an answer, the fog parted slightly, revealing an ancient, weathered crypt half buried under twisted vines. He had never seen it before, but something inside him knew that it was important. The voices seemed to grow louder, urging him toward the crypt. Taking a deep breath, Alex approached the entrance. The iron gate was rusted and heavy, but it swung open with an eerie ease. Inside, the air was thick and stale, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the darkness. Holding his phone's flashlight in front of him, he ventured inside, the whispers guiding him deeper. At the far end of the crypt, he found a stone slab with an inscription carved into it. The words were faded, but he could just make out a warning. "To those who seek what lies beyond the veil. Beware, for the mirror shows only what you fear most." A cold shiver ran through him. He realized that the mirror tombstone wasn't just a headstone. It was a portal, a gateway that trapped souls between life and death. The fog, the voices, the carpenter, they were all bound to it, unable to find peace. And somehow he was part of this now. As Alex stood there, absorbing the weight of the inscription, he heard footsteps approaching from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating a familiar face. Evelyn. She was standing there, her form half-transparent, her eyes hollow and pleading. "Please, you have to help us escape," she whispered. Her voice was filled with anguish. "We're trapped here, bound to the mirror. It feeds on our regrets, our fears. But it also binds itself to those who look into it. People like you." Alex felt a lump form in his throat. "Why me? I didn't do anything. I just saw something I wasn't supposed to." Evelyn shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Once you look into the mirror, you become part of its world. You're marked by the fog. The only way out is to break the mirror." "But how?" Alex asked, feeling desperate. "How do I break something that isn't even real?" Evelyn's gaze softened. "You'll need to confront your deepest fear. The mirror only holds power as long as you're afraid of what it shows you." Alex nodded, swallowing hard. He knew what he had to do, but he was terrified. All his life, he had been haunted by the memory of that night, by the image of the carpenter and the endless fog. Now he would have to face it head-on, or risk being trapped here forever. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex returned to the mirror tombstone. The fog swirled around him, and he could feel the trapped souls watching, waiting to see if he would succeed where they had failed. He looked into the polished surface and saw himself, his reflection distorted, warped by his fear. Behind him stood the carpenter, his hand reaching out just like before, his face a twisted mask of pain and longing. Alex forced himself to hold his ground, refusing to look away. The carpenter's image in the mirror seemed to come to life, stepping closer, his hand almost touching Alex's shoulder. But instead of running, Alex faced him, his voice steady. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," he said, his words echoing through the fog. "I know you're trapped, but I won't be." At that moment, a crack appeared in the mirror's surface, spiderwebbing outward. The carpenter's figure flickered, and then the image of Evelyn appeared, her eyes filled with gratitude. As the mirror shattered, the fog began to dissipate, releasing the trapped souls. One by one, they faded into the air, their voices finally silent. Alex felt a rush of cold air pass over him, and he knew they were free. When he looked down, he saw fragments of the mirror scattered on the ground, reflecting nothing but the empty sky above. Exhausted, he stumbled out of the cemetery as dawn began to break, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. He felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The fog was gone, and with it, the spirits that had haunted him for so long. As he walked away, he knew he would never return to the cemetery. The souls had found peace, and so had he.